AT&T. And then also this morning, Ryan Henningsen, who is moderating this morning's session, and he provided, Edward D. Jones and Ryan provided the snacks this morning, and he did a good job on the snacks. So let's thank Ryan for that. And Ryan, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, John. Yeah, thank you to the City of Ottawa for hosting us and recording and broadcasting and providing the coffee this morning as well. So a couple announcements before we get started. There's Mark. Hi, Mark. How are you? First off, thanks for being here. I know we're coming off hopefully a fun evening celebrating Valentine's Day last night. For those of you gentlemen that forgot to get a gift, they're half off today, so you can still make it work. Yes, I may have done that once or twice in my life. So, just a couple announcements as we get rolling, and I want to yield as much time to you all as we possibly can. But just a couple things to keep in mind. It is being recorded. It's being broadcasted, so make sure we're using the microphone so audio can be picked up. John's going to be walking around to the audience here in a minute with the microphone. He'll maintain control of the microphone. We ask, just out of respect of everyone that's here that might have their own questions that they want to discuss, please keep your questions to one per person. You are allowed to ask a question. Just, let's be respectful and appreciative of everyone's time. And please, if you want to ask a question, that's great. We ask that you don't take the time to make comments. So make sure if you are speaking that we have a point and we're going to ask a question to our representatives that have given some of their time to be here with us this morning. So that said, what I think I'd start with is if each of you want to just take a few minutes to kind of discuss what you've been working on, some things you're talking about, and then we'll open it up to questions. Karen, you want to start?
Oh, sure.
You got the gavel.
Okay. I do have the gavel. That's dangerous these days. Well, welcome, you guys. It's good to see you. I'm glad to have such a good crowd here. Beautiful day. I don't know if you like the snow or not, but I love it. So welcome to Kansas, right? It'll be gone in no time. There's been a lot going on. It seems like we were just here yesterday. A few different faces, which is nice. Topeka is interesting this year. I told you last time that each session has its own personality. Well, this personality is one that I have not seen since I've been up there. The Senate Tax Committee, we've always kind of hit the ground running, trying to get things done as quick as possible. But this year in session, everybody is trying to get things done. I told you last time I had heard a rumor they were going to try to get us out in 45 days instead of 90. I don't know if they'll stick to that or not, but it'll be interesting to see. We've been dealing with a lot of issues, property tax, capers. I'm sure you've heard the property tax legislation that we've been working on. It's about transparency and just allowing people to understand the process more simply. The other thing is capers. The governor is trying to mess with capers again. We sent a message loud and clear, 2/3 supermajority, told her leave it alone. Do not try to re-amortize, do not use the bank of capers. She's at it again this year. So we will send another loud message, leave capers alone. We're on target to be 80% funded for capers in, I think it's 2039. That's better than we've ever been before. When I first took office, it was approximately 30% funded. So we'll see how that goes. The other one is the transportation plan. We've got every 10 years we used to have a major transportation plan, and this year the secretary's taken a different approach. It is a long-term plan, but she's planning on doing the plan within 2 to 3 year increments. I had her in my office, and I always bring it up whenever she sees me walking down the hall. She knows 68, 169, 69. There's other projects too, but those are critical, especially 68. We all know that. We lose lives on that highway, and it needs to be addressed. Mental health, also big issue for the state of Kansas. I've been beating that drum for a while, and finally got notice from the governor's office. They will lift the moratorium at Osawatomie. Now, what that, years ago, Governor Brownback put a moratorium on, and it limited the number of beds that are available at Osawatomie State Hospital. It's around 140 some. With the moratorium coming off, we could get up to over 200 beds again. And we need it. Those beds are needed in Kansas. The bad news is they plan to take 1.5 years to do that. The good news is they are going to have 8 beds here fairly quickly available. So we'll continue to beat that drum and continue to do what we can for mental health in Kansas. I had 2 special pages with me this week. I had Amelia Kaler and Reagan Paddock. It was really nice to have locals. I sent them over to the House chamber, which we don't usually do, so that they could watch our House members, especially since Representative Finch was in the chair that day. So it worked out really nicely. I look forward to your questions today. That's the best thing about the coffee, is hearing what's on your guys' mind. This is a back and forth, and I like to hear what the community's thinking. So thanks for being here.
Sure. Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. Hope everybody had a wonderful Valentine's Day. There's certainly plenty of love going around the Capitol right now. The big issues that you've probably heard about, the constitutional amendment is still a big one. And a lot of moving pieces on it. I'm still hopeful and optimistic that there can be compromise and work out the remaining issues so that something can get done that works for the vast majority of folks. That's one of the avenues that can be taken. The other one is there's still some mindset of trying to pressure folks to get certain votes, and I think that's been extended to about as far as it's going to go. So I'm hopeful that we can work on the issues that remain and get something worked out rather than the other side of things. As Senator Tyson was alluding to, we've had very good news and progress on mental health issues. The Christy L. Bennett Mental Parity Health Act, we had a hearing on that in the Insurance Committee and the House Insurance Committee. Representative Gene Vickery of Miami County is the chairman of that committee. We've been working closely with representatives on both sides of the aisles. The testimony there was powerful. A lot of the stories heartbreaking on what folks are sometimes having to do just to get coverage to help with mental health issues, depression perhaps being one of the leading ones. But things that are done, whether it's in the hospital. I mean, Advent offered some powerful testimony about things they've seen, and then other issues where folks are being denied coverage. So we've addressed legislation to try to get that done. We also had some fairly strong opposition testimony, the insurers among others. But right now, everybody is at the table on that. That's good, positive movement. Heaven forbid that we work together and work something out, but that's actually what's taking place at the moment. And we're seeing if we can get something worked out with the insurers, so whether it's changes in insurance policy, if that's what's needed, or if legislation's needed. And huge credit to some of our own constituents here in the district because they've been heavily involved. They've been in Topeka. They're giving up time away from their jobs and their families. Jen Cook in particular is one of them. She's done an amazing job. We've also had a couple other families that have been tragically affected by this from the Johnson County area and others across the state. So that's incredibly helpful. I want to thank them. One that's near and dear to my heart, about half the states in the country have passed legislation to help with abuse and harassment of sports officials. So that's one that I've looked into. Many of you may know that I officiate a lot of sports in this area. So that's one that we've introduced and are working on. In particular, youth sports is one that's of concern to us. So for the teenagers that are out there getting their first jobs and learning those skills, the harassment and abuse that takes place sometimes at youth sports events. The Attorney General's been very active over in the House with us, Derek Schmidt. You've probably heard me before say that I think he does an outstanding job. One of the issues that he's been working on is the Kansas Indoor Clean Air Act, and whether vaping and e-cigarettes and things of those nature fall under it. So we've been working on that and hearing testimony on those issues. Another big one, and this is a great example of not only positive movement, I think, but what good things can happen when we work together. The AG had concern about issues of statewide interest, one of those being the opioid lawsuits that have been popping up. But it's problematic for him. He obviously is supposed to be looking out for the whole state, and he tries to resolve things in the best interest of the state and all of our citizens. And he has many of those players at the table in trying to get those worked out. But when he has multiple lawsuits all across the state from varying entities, while those are probably for good intents and purposes, it makes it harder for him to coordinate the litigation at the statewide level. So he actually offered legislation. He wanted it to essentially be a prohibition from, if it was going to be a contingent type case of local governments from being able to bring those lawsuits unless he gave them permission and entered a waiver. Local governments stepped up to the table and had a lot of heartburn with a number of those issues because they will use contingent fee attorneys on a number of things that really is not of statewide interest and the state wouldn't have interest in. But so what they wanted to come back with was essentially flipping the prohibition, but rather providing the Attorney General notice and then allowing the Attorney General to opt in if he thought it was appropriate. So that has been in the works. We did have a hearing on it, and then again, to their credit, the key players have been at the table, including our chairman of the judiciary, and then a few of the attorneys, including myself, have been able to work closely with them on that. So that's kind of a broad overview of where we're at. Look forward, if any of those are of interest to you, happy to answer questions on that. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Representative Finch.
Good morning, everybody. Based on the size of the muffins back there, you're probably halfway through, so I'll try to talk you through the second half of your muffin so you can then come up with questions. I do know that what Ryan didn't say about the Valentine's Day gifts being half price is you should take the other half and invest it in your 401k or IRA with Edward Jones. So want to make sure we get that in there. We've been hard at work on a number of things in the House. A lot of the action right now in both chambers is in committees. Committees are hearing bills and working bills and vetting ideas. Last time we talked about the Make Kansas Work program. We've seen some action on those bills. The Kansas Promise Act, the one about scholarships to develop workforce in our state, has made it out of committee. It'll probably run across the House floor sometime this week or first part of next. The Targeted Employment Act, we've been working with folks from COF here in Ottawa and EnterHab, their statewide group. That bill has been heard in committee, and I think there's a compromise balloon amendment, is what we call it, when they take all the changes and put them in one document, and I think the committee's going to take that up sometime this week, and hopefully we'll get the second piece of legislation in that Make Kansas Work package out of committee. We've also been working, I've personally worked on something, the case is called Hilburn. Hilburn is the one that struck down the cap on non-economic damages in the state of Kansas. So in other words, those kinds of pain and suffering damages and lawsuits, Kansas has for many decades had a cap on those. When you remove that cap, trial lawyers are happy because they can get more money for their clients, and of course that means more money for them. But insurance companies are not happy, businesses are not happy because the costs of doing business can go up at that point. And one of the things that happened in that case is that the court said, in the opinion, the statute was unconstitutional and struck it down, but then came out the same day with a press release that said, but this doesn't affect medical malpractice. So as lawyers, we're taught press releases aren't binding precedent, but the case is. And so there's a real question in the law right now, and that affects every doctor and nurse and practitioner across our state because they don't know whether they're covered or not. They don't know whether there's a cap or not, and of course it can affect the cost of health care for every Kansan. So I've got a bill that tries to expedite the process of getting that question back in front of the Supreme Court so that we can get an answer. And then if we need to make statutory or legislative changes, we can do that. But we need that certainty for our medical providers so that they're not out there left in the gap, not knowing whether they're covered or not. We got to meet with a lot of people from the district. The Franklin County leadership class was up this week. Judy Davis Cole is in the Capitol several days out of the week. We finally got our meeting. Only took about 3 reschedules to get that done. And then this week we also had 3 different groups that serve my district in on domestic violence and sexual assault, including the Willow and the SOS group over in Osage County. And it's great to talk to those folks and find out what their needs are in the state's budget and how they help people here in the district. As Mark said, we're still working on finding votes on the Life Amendment. That's an important issue. We're not done with that. We're going to continue to talk and work through that process. The House did pass 2 bills this week on final action. The first concerned a cemetery in Valley Falls that has been of interest to one member for about 17 years that he's been working on this bill. So persistence does sometimes pay off. We finally got that one passed. And then the other was the removing the spousal exception for sexual battery. Under this weird wrinkle in Kansas law, you could actually treat your spouse worse than you could treat a stranger on the street when it came to sexual battery, and the House voted to remove that exemption in the law and say that you should treat all people the same, regardless of whether you're married to them or not. We would hope that's a good step in the right direction to change the law and update it. So, got plenty of other things we can talk about. Lots of things happened this week. I'm sure you read about them in the news, and I want to make sure we got time for your questions. So, with that, I'll stop and let Ryan and John take over.
Okay, so John, if you have a question, just raise your hand, and John will come by with the microphone. And I'm going to be a little selfish here and start with the first question for Representative Samsel. And I'm sorry if this is too direct or makes you uncomfortable, but I strongly disagree with your bill to make the watermelon the state fruit. I am not a watermelon fan. So, John, I think I saw some hands already.
If we did an amendment to go seedless, could we get you there?
Well, I'm also curious if you've heard the presentation yet from the third graders at Central Heights,
saw
because
some of
I was
that,
also on the fence, but they were pretty dang persuasive, so.
Yeah.
Okay, my name is John Holland, and basically one of the things that I never hear you guys talking about, and I haven't heard it, I've attended many of these sessions, and that is the fact that the Ottawa school system itself has gone from 173 homeless students to 195. And basically, that with 195 homeless kids, that's basically children that are going to be exposed more to drugs, sexual predators, crime. Basically, we don't have a foster care program that seems to be working. It's considered to be broken. There's lawsuits coming, and even if the kids did end up coming into the foster care program, then they would basically end up being put into the pipeline for the prison system, which is what we're finding out from our foster care, examination of foster care programs. And then we find that our prisons are broken. And so the question I have is that, you know, since we want to basically have this anti-abortion amendment and, you know, all that sort of thing, are we actually planning to take care of the children in any way, shape, or form now or later?
You touch on a number of issues there. I think we can talk about several of them. One, we've seen a $1.3 billion increase in school funding in the state of Kansas over the last 6 legislative sessions. There is a lot more money flowing into public education to help with all kinds of problems. We do have at-risk funding that is set to sunset this year that is an issue for the Ottawa School District that they've identified, and it's one of the things that we're working through in the process right now. Last year, the Republican Party in the House put more money into the budget for foster care to help try to heal up that system and give the resources that are needed. Personally, I've worked on several bills to help young people in crisis, including in mental health crisis, and I think those bills were supported by everyone up here this morning. So we understand that there's a problem there and have tried to work through it. I, of course, carried the Senate Bill 367, the juvenile justice reform overhaul to try to move kids out of incarceration and get them community-based services that they need. Actually had a meeting just last week with folks who are working on this issue, including the prosecutors in the state, including mental health, community mental health centers, and we have legislation coming forward to actually increase the flow of money out of that juvenile reinvestment fund out into the communities to increase the number and types of services that are available for those young people. So I think we are all aware that we have to make investments in young people, and I think everyone at this dais up here has done that, and we continue to try to do that to help stem that tide. Of course, we also know that those kids need a good family at home. They need their parents to create a safe and stable environment as well. So I think we're all on board with doing what we can do and trying to empower the school district to do what it can do. But at the end of the day, we've got to have those other community partners as well.
You know, I thank you for the question. It's timely with what happened to me yesterday. I'll say it's not just about the money. We do need money and resources, but we also need management. That's one of the examples. We have contracted out that program, and there are some programs and things that the state do that should not necessarily be contracted. We need to take a deep look at that also. But yesterday I was driving to the Capitol, and this is my 10th year to be a legislator. I have never missed a day of session. I am committed to you guys. I am committed to be up there and to do my work. But driving to session yesterday, it broke my heart. I saw a child with no gloves, no coat. It was 2 degrees out. The wind was blowing. I made a decision. Do I miss session, or do I take care of this child? Well, I stopped. I knew he had at least 6 blocks to walk, and he had walked much further than that. He would not get in the vehicle. I was a stranger. So I reached out to police and did what I could. The policeman followed up with me. The nurse had checked with the child. The child had felt like he had missed the bus, and he thought this was his only way to get to school. So yes, we have to be aware of these situations, and it did break my heart. Luckily, they kept session open till 11:30, and I was able to make it. So I did the right thing, but our children are a priority in our state, and we just need to be aware of where the money's going. Is it getting to these programs, the oversight, or is it actually getting to the people in need? And we need to make sure we do that throughout the state, through all our programs.
Thank you. John, I appreciate the question. That's one that's near and dear to my heart as well. And that's when we have this conversation, and it is a big issue, a constitutional amendment. And when we talk about being pro-life, I always encourage us to hopefully remember that that includes life all the way through. And so early childhood education is something that we've made good progress on, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Kids age 3 to 5, if they're not, there's a lot of them. By the time that they're stepping into kindergarten, they're a lot of ways behind, and the challenges don't involve education. Well, those do exist, but they've got other problems of just clean clothes, food, having a stable environment when they're home. And investment does bring huge returns. If we can invest in our young people early, hopefully that does keep them out of our prisons or encountering other problems that they will. I unfortunately haven't been able to invest a lot of time in our overall foster care system, but I've had just within the last year 2 instances of where foster parents have reached out to me for help, and unfortunately we haven't found good answers for them yet. So we've got a lot of work to do on those. And that's actually one of the things I always encourage folks, if you can find the time to work with our young people. They're amazing, they're inspiring. Just a couple of my officiating stories. I was working a game in the city once, and it was their senior night. And in our areas, that's a pretty big deal. Most of us are blessed. We've got grandma, grandpa, and our parents show up. Out of the 7 seniors, only one of them had a family member show up, and that's the environment they were born and raised in. Similarly, I had a senior at a different game, and he was the one who kept causing problems throughout the game. Turns out, talked to the coach, he's never had a parent show up to any single game in his entire life. So those are issues certainly that we can work on, but it's also going to be more than just what we can get done from Topeka. So making sure we include our communities. And that's why I love spending time in our schools whenever possible. And it's a common story you hear, unfortunately, from a lot of the kids in various ways, shapes, and form. But when they learn that you care about them, you can get a lot more, and the return on the investment's huge, and it's a pretty rewarding aspect. So I appreciate the question, and if anybody has any ideas on other things we can be doing, certainly welcome those. But that's definitely something that's a priority, I know, up here, and something hopefully we'll keep making progress on.
My name's Darrell McEwen. There's another push for voucher legislation that actually supports the myth that public schools are bad and private schools are great. One of them is House Bill 2552. It's called the Reading Readiness Readiness Act. 3rd and 4th graders scoring low on state ELA assessments are eligible for a voucher equivalent to the state aid plus the at-risk weighting. The money is then put in a special fund for parents to use for private school instruction if they choose, but they can even stay in the public schools and do the same at the same time, I guess. It's a little unclear. Also, House Bill 2465, which is the expansion of the tuition tax credit program, and expands the current law to include any free or reduced lunch student from any public school. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and your opinion about that?
Their House bills.
I haven't seen either one.
Their House bills, I have not seen the legislation, so I'll be anxious to see where it goes.
And I haven't studied those specific bills yet, but I've seen some in the past and generally aware of them. My position on those have always been, while private schools and home schools are incredibly important and play very important roles in our children's lives, my experience has been, though, that public funds, taking away funds from our public schools or moving kids around is usually not the best solution to those issues. Our public schools bring in kids of all different backgrounds, and so doing everything we can to make those schools successful has been a priority of mine, while also trying to do what we can to support our private schools. But to me, I try not to make it at the expense of the public schools and what those tax dollars may go towards.
I haven't seen either one of these bills yet. I think they're both still in committee. I think one of them may have had a hearing. I'm not sure the other one has even had a hearing, and we're getting pretty late in this first part of session for that to happen. I guess I'd be surprised if either one got above the line on the House floor and voted on this year. Believe it or not, there's a little fatigue in talking about schools and school finance in Topeka, so we will see. I think I know on the one that's on the tax credit, so for a lot of people, the jargon gets specific when you get down any sort of rabbit hole in Topeka in different areas. That tuition tax credit allows for private businesses to get a tax credit or individuals for donating to a fund that is then used, so it's not the public dollars that are moving away. And my understanding is that fund is like, it has a $10 million cap on it, and there's only ever been 2 or 3 donors. It
Yeah.
doesn't have much money. So I think when people talk about failing public schools and wanting to move kids away, I think a lot of times that's more of a coastal phenomenon. The rhetoric doesn't really fit here in the Midwest. We tend to have really great public schools in Kansas. We tend to have dedicated teachers and administrators who try very hard to meet the needs of kids. If anything, we've asked schools to do so much beyond their core mission. We talked just a minute ago about homeless children and foster care, and we're asking schools to do so much more than educate, and then we're surprised when the education part kind of comes at the end of the line. We shouldn't be. And so I think that sometimes the heated rhetoric around this issue from the coast filters back here, and people think, well, I'll just go to a private school and things will be so much better. Many of our parts of our state, there is no private alternative. And I think you're seeing that when you put this up to the marketplace and say, all right, here's a fund, you can donate, and if you want your child to go to a school, and you get 2 or 3 donors and the fund is never used to capacity, that probably tells you that generally people are fairly satisfied with the public schools in Kansas, because that program's not really being used to a high degree. So I doubt either one of them get a lot of traction this year because of the school fatigue, the school discussion fatigue that's going on in Topeka. But I do think, and I hope that now that funding is not really being discussed, where we can really get to some other issues about, is this the right place for this or that program to be in our school? Is this the right function for our school to be performing? Or are we taking away from core education time because we're ensuring that schools are doing other things? And I'm not criticizing any of those other things, but we are using our schools as a service delivery point for a lot of other programs, and they're not being able to focus and concentrate on their core mission. So long way around that answer, but that's my hope, is that we can do more of what we want to do and what teachers went to school to do, help and educate kids.
Here we go.
Thanks for being here. Good morning, Mike Skidmore. Last time we talked about the property tax issue with regard to public hearings for our budgets. And although I appreciate the intent, I think transparency is very important. But is there any record, any information on how those models have worked in Utah and Tennessee to get greater participation from the voting public?
Thank you for the question. We worked the bill. It was Senate Bill. Well, actually, we worked several property tax bills this week. One of them was Senate Bill 294, the main transparency one that you're talking about. For those of you that don't remember, myself and others, we spent a lot of time studying this and working on it and trying to come up with a solution. We keep hearing that property taxes are too high. That's one of the common comments that we get as legislators. And so what we decided to do, and there's individuals that don't like the lid, what the lid was intended to do was cap property taxes, and then if it was supposed to be an increase in taxes, it was supposed to go to the vote of the people. Well, looking at that and doing the analysis on it, what we broke it down to was we modeled it after legislation in 2 states working. We didn't reinvent the wheel. It's Tennessee and Utah. Utah has had this in place for over 35 years. They do have the mailing notice. They used to have the newspaper notice also, but they did remove the newspaper notice. Currently, we've left that in the bill, in the legislation, that we have both in Kansas. It's still to move forward. The mailing notice, we've had a gentleman from Tennessee, the president, he was former president, he was the tax chairman, and he's a CPA. And they asked about the mailing notices. And he said, if that's your reason for not doing this legislation, it's basically not a good reason, because the taxpayers like it. In fact, a majority of taxpayers, to pay for the mailing, they probably would do that in order to have the transparency. And people say, well, you can follow the budget process, that we're transparent in that manner. Yes, you are, but most people don't understand this. This simplifies it. You would have a mailing notice that would come to each taxpayer that would state each of the, and it's up to the county clerk if they want to handle it for that taxing area or not. Then the other, it would fall on the taxing authority. There is a senator, a Democrat, that's going to bring an amendment to make it mandatory for the clerks to send out that mailer, that we know where that comes from. We'll see if that goes on or not. But it is just a simple form that tells you, you know, this is what your property tax is going to be in from this taxing authority. So if it's a county, city, whatever it may be. We did exclude schools, and talking to Representative Finch, he had a great idea. The schools can be on the report. There's no exclusion from the report. The schools can actually be on the report so you can see what their increase is. But we did exclude them from the truth in taxation hearing. So after the notices went out, there would be a hearing, and the public officials would vote whether to accept or raise your taxes the full amount, partial, or none at all. And they can have the budget hearing at the same time. There's nothing that excludes that. So we made some changes to help make the process less painful. The reporting methodology, there's currently a report that the clerks file with the Director of Accounting. Director of Accounting is going to add a couple of fields to that report, and so it will be the same report that's filed now. Yes, there is a cost with the mailing and the notification, but from what we're hearing, a majority of taxpayers would want that. They do want that. Because now they hear the budget process, and most of them don't. In fact, there was a comment made at a meeting here in Franklin County Monday night, and the lady said, you know, because they kept saying, well, we do put this out there, we do put the budget out there. And the lady, a constituent responded and said, you're making me feel dumb, because I necessarily can't follow the budget process. So we're trying to simplify it and make it as easy as possible so that you know if your taxes are going to go up or not, and you have some input. It does not stop tax increases. It does not limit them. In fact, I made an amendment to remove the property tax lid completely. So when this goes into effect, the lid would be removed the same day. We want transparency and local control, and that's what this legislation goes for.
Anything else to add?
You know, I guess I would say this. I've seen a number of these property tax discussions, the property tax lid several years ago. I think what tends to happen is this becomes an issue where people are talking past each other or at each other. The reality is state and local government is not the enemy of state government. Yeah. And vice versa. We have some of the hardest working public servants that I've ever worked with work in local government, whether it's city or county or school district. And I think sometimes the outside groups begin to turn up the rhetoric, and it appears that this is the state versus locals. And I think the reality is the property tax system in Kansas is incredibly complicated for people to understand. I remember when I was a city commissioner, a former mayor at that time had written an editorial in the newspaper and run through an example of a mill levy calculation, and it was wrong. And that was a person who had been the mayor on numerous occasions, and been on city commission for a long time. If somebody who is involved in setting that levy didn't fully understand the process, the hope for a person who's not connected to it, is not nearly as great. So I think having added transparency in the system, however we get there, is a good thing. I think the tax lid has been a failure. It creates a perverse incentive for cities and counties to raise taxes, because if they don't, they lose capacity to do that in a time of crisis. And so I think if we have an alternative that relies on more disclosure and transparency in exchange for getting rid of a piece of public policy that doesn't work, I think that's a good thing. And I think we ought to be talking constructively together about how we both honor the efforts of local government and the people who serve there, and how we can increase the transparency so that taxpayers can say, oh, okay, now I understand why my taxes went up here. It was because the appraiser made this decision that my property was worth more, or it's because the mill levy changed. But rather than everyone kind of pointing at a decentralized way, well, this is the appraiser's fault, well, this is the county's fault, this is the school district's fault, having that transparency and disclosure can be helpful so people understand what's going on with the system, and I think that's good. I think that's a step in the right direction, and one that we should work on together.
If I may follow up, I appreciate the representative's comments, especially, and Janet, she's been working very hard. We've been in constant communication back and forth. In fact, I called her this week because I was working on a couple of amendments, and I know she was in a meeting and wasn't able to take the phone. So I have other clerks that are helping me out too, other state appraisers, county appraisers. We've been working very diligently to get buy-in from all groups. And yes, there are some outliers that try to make this inflammatory and pit it a bad person against a good person. That is not what's going on here. We are trying to get the best legislation for Kansas and work together to get that solution. Taxpayers want to know, and local governments need their own control, and that's what this is. Just to point out real quickly, you may not know this, I didn't know this until recently. In Franklin County, property taxes went up 7% last year. Ottawa property tax went up 9%, while the mill levy decreased. And it was publicized that the mill for the city decreased over 2 mil, and the decline in the mill for the county was 0.2 mil. So based off those numbers, you would hear that the mill went down. You might assume your taxes went down when you actually paid a larger amount. And that's what most people are concerned about. What are they writing the check for? It's a bigger amount. And so let's just get that clarification out there and get the conversation going. And that's what this would do.
Yeah, without trying to repeat that, the tax lid, I think there's a pretty good consensus that that was not a good thing despite good intentions at the time. So I hope the movement to repeal that does continue. Certainly I've heard from my local government officials that that's something they're supportive of. One of those unintended consequences was that if you didn't raise the property taxes any particular year, it not only cost the revenue for that year, but cumulative, you couldn't raise it in following years to accommodate for that. So generally, I think that's a good thing if we can keep that moving. And then, as one of my city administrators reminded me, if we look at it historically, and Representative Finch is absolutely correct, our local governments are arms of the state, and we should be partnering and working together to get the best results for everybody, because we're all Kansans and we all should be rowing the same ship in the same direction, we hope. But back in the day, the state, in his understanding, and I think he's correct, was that the state had taken away some of the options or avenues for local governments to provide the services that we provide here in our communities. And as part of that promise, the state had promised at the time to help provide some of the revenue so that they could still maintain those same level of services over time. Unfortunately, we haven't done the best job of maintaining that support for our local governments, so they were left with little options at the local level other than looking to property taxes to help fund those services. So while there are a handful of other ones there, and I appreciate all of Senator Tyson's work on this, I hope we also still consider some other options that I know that the House has discussed, such as whether the state will look at reinstating help, whether they can do something to help our local units of government. The state does not assess a very high property tax level, but it could be considered to reduce that slightly, which would help reduce the property tax burden. Or another one that perhaps is in play is property tax credits, so that while the local governments are still assessing at the rates and able still to maintain those levels of service, that helps mitigate some of the burden on those of us who pay our property taxes. There are other tax debates and discussions going on, such as income tax related discussions. My concern with those, though, is if that's what our only focus is, we've got seniors and others who don't have income levels or rising income levels. So while it's certainly, I think we could help a lot of folks with income tax relief, the property tax component of it's still key, I think, there. So I look forward to this discussion as we continue to move forward. Property tax issues are certainly a high concern that I heard from voters as I was knocking doors early on and have continued to hear from since then. So I appreciate all the work that's being done on it and all the options that are still in play there.
Yes, I wanted to follow up. Robert Tyson, I'm related to Karen. Used to be your senator years ago. I think there's a little confusion there. Isn't it true that the property tax bill that you've spent all summer working on and introduced only thing it does is if your property tax valuation goes up. So that reduces the mill levy, so they have exactly the same amount collected as they're going to get collected last year, and they can raise it to whatever they want to, but the commissioners or city officials have to vote on the increase, and the people can see what's happening. Right now, they blame, like we're talking about, oh no, the state raised that, no, the county appraiser says no, I didn't do it, the commissioner said no, the county appraiser, and this would just simplify the whole thing so that people could just see where their vote is. And I had a second quick question, is the abortion bill that passed out of the Senate strong enough to go a constitutional amendment because the legislature passed a bill that said dismembering a late-term baby was against the law, and the Supreme Court said, no, that's in the Constitution, state constitution. And so this bill just simply puts it back to the legislature. And I wondered what the House finds problematic with that.
Is this guy a plant?
Actually, he's not. And I am so glad he's here because I tend to get in the weeds, and he explains it so eloquently. Yes, the tax bill is about transparency, and it does give the equal amount of dollars for the previous year, and then the vote would be taken in public of the governing body. It would not be a vote of the people as was reported in the paper. It's a vote of the governing body. And you got to look at the flip side of it too, because we're facing this reality in Lynn County. There's a possibility of the Lacing power plant closing. It's about 60% of the valuation for the county. So the flip side of that is they would collect the same money as the previous year if they chose to. So that means if something was to happen that the valuations bottom out, then we would be talking a major tax increase available to the counties without going to a notice. But if they want to increase above the valuations, it definitely goes to a notice. So thank you. And I wish he was a plant, but the pro-life issue, I'll let you address that.
Yeah, the second question, to pass a constitutional amendment in Kansas through the Senate takes 27 votes, through the House it takes 84. The House had 80 votes when we voted on it. The four Republicans who did not vote for it, one did not really cite a reason other than just general opposition to the amendment. 3 said they would like to see it at a different ballot. And then there were several Democrats who are traditionally been pro-life voting Democrats, and they have given various reasons. We know that the governor has worked them And that happens when we had a Republican governor. They called Republican legislators in and talked to them, but they were worried about things from being primaried from the left in their districts to what ballot it may be on to concerns about the language of the amendment. There's kind of reasons all over, but there are at least, I would say, 9 to 10 votes in the Kansas House that have traditionally been pro-life that did not vote for that amendment, and that was surprising.
Yeah, and to clarify on that amendment, it's just not dismemberment abortion, it's live dismemberment abortion. That's how they abort the baby, is by cutting it up to pieces while it's alive. So it is very controversial that our courts overruled this and found it in the Constitution.
Well, and I'll add on that last one there. And the 4 guys who voted against it, I respect tremendously. One of them is an 80-year-old farmer. He's a freshman member from way out in western Kansas, Bill Panbacker. And the comment he made before this issue popped up is that if it was going to be any change to our Constitution, he wanted it on the general election ballot where historically there's been higher turnout, and that there'd be perhaps a broader view of Kansans on the vote. But that was what he told his local newspaper. He brought his local paper to the well, showed it to everybody, and to his credit, in the space of a lot of opposition, he stuck to his guns on it. So rightly or wrongly, that's what his position was, and he stuck to it. So perhaps that's an amendment that gets made, maybe it's not, but the general election was one of the issues, and that's been raised by people in this room who've reached out to me and had similar concerns. So, and that's on both sides of the aisle I've heard from. The second one that's been mentioned is, and while I appreciate that interpretation, another thing that I've heard is that there's a whole lot of, whether it's misinformation or different understandings, but what exactly does this amendment do? And on the one hand, while I know we've got a pretty clear interpretation of what we think it is, if there is any ambiguity in it, the folks who made the last decision are the same folks who get to rule on any constitutional question. So if it's in the Constitution and it's not clear, it goes right back to those 7 justices across the street. And then the last one, again, from folks that's sitting in the room right now that I've heard raised with me, but there's the language that would be then in the Constitution pertaining to rape, incest, and then health of the mother. They have concerns with how that's worded in this amendment, and whether part of their concern or their heartburn is if we get this thing passed, they're concerned that if moving forward, that there are movements to come forward with, whether it's a complete ban or other restrictions, that could be done by a simple majority vote. That's probably not likely, but that's what their concern is. So those are things that have been raised, and that's where I started this thing at. I'm hoping if we can be reasonable and work these things out, there's a very strong pro-life movement where we can get something in our Constitution that protects what a majority of Kansans, I do believe a vast majority probably would like to have protected, while fleshing out some of these other issues. So, and hopefully we can get that done sooner rather than later, because there is large agreement on it, and then work on these other issues that you guys have raised for us here.
Without getting in the weeds regarding abortion, what does this single issue have the potential to do to the entire session in terms of log jamming potential bills and other things? Just curious how things are going to flow with the problematic issue it seems to be for not having passed that resolution or that possible amendment.
Well, currently, we haven't seen the logjam. I know that there were bills referred back to committee, House bills in the Senate, but we're in the stage of session where a majority of the work is done in committee right now anyway. So could there be a logjam? Yes, there could, but I have a feeling we're going to get this worked out. I'm very optimistic about it. You know, this has recourse much beyond pro-life. It is a pro-life issue that we are talking about, but the court's ruling, if you read it, we're on a slippery slope with this ruling. It basically, and Blaine can give you the legalese, I just read it as a lay person, and to me, it was unbelievable that they are saying that in the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that they can find abortion. So what else can they find in those words too? You know, we legislate whether somebody can drive at a certain age. We legislate whether they can smoke or drink. All that opens up now as to whether we can legislate that or not with this court's ruling. It's a slippery slope. So we need to address this. We need to fix this. I know you guys have heard me talk about it, but this court also, our state Supreme Court, 3 men used fake IDs, fake social security numbers. If you and I did that, we would be prosecuted. Well, they did not prosecute these men. The Supreme Court ruled they could not be prosecuted because they are illegal immigrants. So it's a federal issue. So that means that federal, if you're here illegally, we can't hold you to the same standard that we want every other Kansan to be held to. Think about that. We've got a rogue court.
My name is Cindy Kirshner, and you talk about this being a pro-life issue. What about pro-choice? People
Actually-
have a choice, and I don't believe that legislatures, any body of legislator, has the right to make those choices for a person. I'm not saying it's right for me. I don't know what I would do in those situations. I hope I will never have to face that choice. But I believe that people have a choice. How do you feel about choice? Do you have a choice?
I am pro-life, and as in the foster care system, we are protecting those that cannot speak for themselves, and we are protecting that baby that is unborn. I am pro-life.
I want to follow up, though. How, you're pro-life, but yet, John asked a question earlier about how you're going to take care of those lives for years and years and years as they get through what undoubtedly will be the foster system, and that's well unfunded or underfunded.
Undermanaged, I would say.
Undermanaged, mismanaged, underfunded, however you want to look at it. I still think there's some choices to be made, and I don't believe that any legislative body has the right. The Constitution, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. I don't know what to say.
Thank
Let-
you. Yeah.
Let me clarify a little bit about the amendment, because there's a lot of information out there, and
It wouldn't stop
yeah,
abortion.
clearly,
It would not.
good people on both sides have different opinions, and this is where we start the process of talking past each other again. The question that would be put to the voters is whether or not they believe there is a right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution, and then if there is not, the legislature then has the authority or ability to regulate the practice in the state of Kansas, subject to federal law. So Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, those cases are federal cases. The federal Supreme Court has found a right to abortion in the U.S. Constitution, right? And that's part of the privacy right in Griswold versus Connecticut, and I think it's Eisenbarth. And this respects that federal jurisprudence. This Kansas amendment does not go against the federal constitutional findings of the U.S. Supreme Court, but it does say, is there a separate state right? Nobody thought there was a right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution until April of last year. That's when the Supreme Court's decision came out. And if you had asked a legal scholar to tell you whether or not such a right existed in the Kansas Constitution, they would have said, no, it's not there. So this is new. In over 150 years of our state's jurisprudence, this is a brand-new ruling. And I understand people saying they don't want the legislature to decide, but you essentially had 7 members of the state Supreme Court make that decision and decide that the right did exist when no one has ever understood it to be there before. So while people can disagree on whether you're pro-life or pro-choice or whatever label you want to put on it, I think when the court acted that way to make that finding, many of us in the legislature who are pro-life are saying, let's put that before the public and let them make the decision. Do they believe that right exists or not? Everyone, regardless of whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, can show up and vote and make your voice heard on that issue. That's kind of where we're at. The amendment does not ban the practice in the state of Kansas. It does not go beyond the federal Constitution or federal Supreme Court cases. It simply addresses the issue that was raised by the Kansas Supreme Court in its decision last year. Yeah.
And John, I would just quickly add on that, and you asked a question. The other thing I always tell people, this is a very tough issue, and it's one that we are never, ever, ever going to agree on. And while we all have our own personal viewpoints on it, I do my best to represent the views of the district and vote accordingly. And it's a pretty strong district with regards to their viewpoints on that. And like I said, we're never going to agree. That's why I hope we do share with equal passion and equal vigor what we can do to where hopefully we can agree, which is reducing unwanted pregnancies and some of those unfortunate situations. And then after the children are born, doing everything we can to fight to make sure they get a fair shot at life. And a lot of the concerns that John raised, doing what we can there, if that's the path that we go down. So I just wanted to add that. Thanks, John.
My name is Roxy Mettenberg. I have a question. What is the objection to putting it on the general ballot? That seems to be, I'm getting the impression that's the hang-up.
Well, the idea of having it on the August ballot is getting it as quickly as possible so that we do address this issue. Otherwise, so we have abortions. You know, I would definitely debate any day what ballot it goes on. That's fine. In fact, I think, why don't we address school elections too? We've got school elections that can go on a special election instead of waiting for August or November ballot. So let's have that conversation.
Well, I've told everybody my preference is that it does go on the general ballot. It wasn't a strong enough objection to change my vote on the substance of the ballot they put before, or the vote they put before us. But that's one of the ways where I think votes could be switched accordingly. So that's what I hope will continue to be in the discussion as we move forward. I don't envy the job of leadership because I get a lot of pressure to vote on certain things. I know it only increases once you move up that ladder. And so there's groups with very strong feelings on this. So if anyone else has any ideas on how we can work this out as we move forward, but that's the position I've had on it.
It's interesting, the Senate had their debate, Roxy, and they did have an amendment to move it to November. That amendment did not pass. For all of the folks in the House who say they wanted to move it to November, not one of them brought an amendment to move it to November, which is interesting, because in the legislature, sometimes people want to preserve the talking point when they go home, but they don't actually want to vote on it, and that's why we don't see an amendment. And so it's pretty curious to me that we never did see an amendment to move it to November during the House debate for those folks. I will tell you that one of the concerns in moving it is that this is a presidential election year with the U.S. Senate seat on the ballot and competitive races in most of the congressional districts that will be on in November. I don't know if all you remember 4 years ago when you turn on the TV in election time, you don't see anything but national ads. There's an incredible amount of national money in the wake of the Citizens United decision that flow into states like Kansas to buy ads. It would be nearly impossible for either perspective, a pro or con on this amendment, to be able to advertise and reach the public and express their position in a November election. This is an issue that has statewide concern, and putting it on a statewide ballot is important to me, and I think it's important to those who want it in November too, but you're going to have those voices drowned out in November. I would also say that this is not radically different or not precedential. Kansas has had numerous constitutional amendments appear on ballots other than November. The most recent one was last year on what is essentially a municipal ballot. Remember the Census Adjustment Amendment? That went on in November of 19, traditionally our lowest turnout election. The amendment concerning the definition of marriage in Kansas was a special election that took place at a non-November, non-August time. I think it might have even been a mail-out ballot on that one. And we've had 98 amendments to the Kansas Constitution. And I think it's in the double digits of amendments that were run on times other than November. So it is not something that's brand new. It's not something that's never been done in our state. We have had constitutional amendment questions on all different kinds of ballots. But as Mark said, we're going to continue to work with folks who have specific issues and try to find compromise and try to find a way we can get to 84 votes in the House and 27 in the Senate. And as John implied in his question, there's a whole lot of other things going on this session we want to work on too. And so we want to try to get things done and moved on so we can move on down the list.
And I would just add, Blaine raises a great point there, and it's especially we see it at the national level, and this is a little bit off topic, but we've had a lot of folks, including within our district there, that want us to be in support of the Convention of States, and one of those issues is campaign finance. And so before we ever get to the substance of any of these issues we've talked about today, how are we putting the folks into office to hopefully reflect the views of the people most accurately, and what we can do to make sure that the folks who go to Topeka are able to advocate as best they can without, I mean, it goes back to George Washington. You look at some of his quotes about the dangers of faction and allowing too much power within certain groups. You go back to the railroad and other groups back in the day. So campaign issue was one that was near and dear to my heart in law school and has continued to be, but usually when we get out in the larger settings, that's not one that pops up very frequently. But that's just one thought that I hope as we continue to move forward. Some states have done something on it, but not one that we've really had much discussion on here, but maybe as we move forward. I know we've got a long list of issues we're working on in our state, but that's one that I think kind of touches on many aspects of most of them.
Well, we're out of time today, so I want to thank you, Representative Samsel, Senator Tyson, Representative Finch, for being here with us this morning. This was good conversations. I appreciate you doing this for our community. And I want to thank everyone that came out today and had questions and attended. A couple quick updates. Again, want to thank our sponsors, Ottawa Chamber of Commerce and the Legislative Action Committee, Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, American Legion Post 60, AT&T, and the City of Ottawa, especially Paul and John back there that have helped us with the broadcast. A couple announcements. The next coffee will be Saturday, March 21st, right here at 10 a.m. And then later this week, there's the WE conference is going to happen at OU at Ottawa University on Thursday. There's 2 times that you could, and it's, Richard, I want to make sure I'm saying this right, but it's going to be a leadership discussion. The first session is from 2 to 4 p.m. at the Hasty Room at the Gibson Center, and then there'll be another evening session from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Frederickson Chapel, and that's, again, this Thursday evening. So if you haven't had a muffin or bagel already, please take one, because I don't think Mr. Walker's going to let me return them after this. So thanks again for being here.